Hello and good afternoon. My name is Barbara Bowes, and on behalf of Career Partners International, welcome to our June 2013 Talent Management Webinar Series. We have a full house today, and I'm really excited to tell you that we have over 800 registrants with participants from Brazil to Canada. Webinars continue to grow and are designed to share ideas, thoughts, and best practices that demonstrate the impact an organization's talent has on business performance. Today, we will showcase some practical tools that you can add to your own toolkit to enhance your personal success as well as the success of your organization. Before we move into the presentation, I want to let you know if you're having some technical difficulties during the presentation, you can call technical support that we've set up for you. Please call at 1-888-259-8414. I also want to remind you that this webinar qualifies for HR recertification with SHRM and HRPO of Ontario, Canada. If you have a question, please type it in the question box. And the question box can be accessed by clicking on the red arrow at the top of your screen to open up the control panel, and then click the question chat feature and type in your question. For your convenience, we're recording today's session, and we will share the link with you to the recording and the slides from today. We are also going to conduct several polls during the session, and we invite you to let us hear your voice through our polls. Now, before getting into our webinar, let me share a little bit about myself. I've been in the human resource consulting field for over 25 years, and I've also had the honor of sharing advice on talent management and human resource issues through a weekly newspaper article and a radio show for the past 10 years. But one of the areas I want to share with you that I've always been passionate about is career management. And this was the first area that I seriously applied the concept of competencies. My first book in 1998 was all about writing a resume using competencies rather than focusing on where you worked and what your job titles were. This was so powerful because it helped people to regain self-esteem when they'd lost a job and to be successful in getting a new job that exactly met their skills and desires. So today I'm particularly pleased to be the facilitator for CPI's webinar, The DNA of High Performance, because I've personally seen and I've personally experienced the power of competencies in all areas of business. And I'm excited to share one of our client success case studies with you. But before I do that, let me introduce you to Career Partners International and our panel of presenters. Career Partners International was founded in 1987. So today you can access 1,600 experts in 200 offices and 40 countries. And we all provide career management, talent development, leadership and executive coaching, career transition and outplacement. Our talent management model is based on our belief the organization's strategic objectives serve as the starting point for designing talent management strategies. And we believe that business and talent management strategies are intertwined and influenced by an organization's culture and values. And also intertwined with this model is our belief in the power of competence. In fact, we see competencies spanning across all aspects of talent management. And today, you are going to learn from our discussions how competencies really do drive success. Let me share with you today's agenda. It's very, very full. We're going to provide a definition of competencies and an example, and we're going to talk about the value of competencies. You will see how research over the years has created the competency lifeline that we have today. And we'll share with you some current research on how high-performing organizations are using competencies. And finally, I'm pleased to introduce you to a client who will share how they have successfully implemented competencies into their organization. And I'm sure as well we'll have time for some participant questions. But first of all, let me introduce the panel of experts that's attending with us today. We have Kevin Kopstick, who is a director with the Institute for Corporate Productivity, also known as I4CP, and he's located in Florida. This organization engages in best practice research that focuses on people practices that make high-performance organizations unique. And Kevin is going to share some of these results in his segment of the program. Mark Minalti is the president and founding partner of HR Dimensions and is our CPI partner in Indianapolis. Mark has a degree in personnel and industrial relations and has more than 25 years of executive management experience managing all functional areas of a company. Mark is going to speak alongside of our CPI client to share the success of their joint project. I also want to introduce Mark's client, Charlie Young, who's the Chief Human Resource Officer with H.H. Gregg, one of the largest electronic and appliance dealerships with approximately 230 locations in the southern United States or eastern United States, and Charlie is also located in Indianapolis. Now, at this time, I want to spend a quick moment to answer this question that I bet many people, or ask this question which many people are probably asking. Just where did the concept of competencies come from? Now, between 1920s and the 1950s, there was a flurry of research. The research tried to link productivity and organizational performance. You're probably already familiar with Frederick Taylor, the scientific management fellow, and John Flanagan and his critical incident techniques might also be familiar to you. But you know, it was 1973 when David McClellan from Harvard came up with the idea of a competency model that identified superior from average performance. And his model was so quickly picked up by the U.S. Navy as well as manufacturing companies such as General Electric and Edison Engineering. And in the 1980s, Richard Boyotis from the Case Western University became well known for his book, The Competent Manager, A Model for Effective Performance. And today, as you might expect, there's many books written, and as well there's competency mapping tools and competency dictionaries and various off-the-shelf models. And of course, competency consulting companies and competency specialists. So as a result, I think over the past 25 to 30 years, using competencies has become quite popular. Well, let's see, because when you registered, you were asked to participate in a poll asking about your use of competencies. So let's just see how popular the use of competency is amongst our listeners. You were asked to fill out the registration poll, and the question is, to what degree do you currently use competencies to support talent management initiatives? And what we see here is that approximately 63% are indeed using competencies moderately to extensively. Now, I know that you also see here 8.3% are still thinking about it, and 22.1% are using competencies from the minimal perspective. So I'm confident today that you will want to do more and integrate more into your talent management system after you listen to our webinar today. Some of you are asking another question. You might be asking, what exactly is a competency? So let me share with you a working definition that I like. This is a simple definition of a competency: a reliable, measurable, and relatively enduring characteristic of a person that causes and statistically predicts the level of performance. It's a simple definition, but at the same time, I think it pays close attention to the behaviors that are measurable and reliable and directly relate to performance. So this is the competency definition that I. Now let me take a step further and share with you one example of a competency statement that's pretty common to many organizations. And this example is from my favorite book, The Talent Management Handbook by Berger and Berger. An achievement orientation targets and achieves results, overcomes obstacles, accepts responsibility, establishes standards and responsibilities, creates a results-oriented environment, and follows through on actions. Now, when you review that statement and your own competency definition, be sure to look for the elements of reliability, sustainability, and measurability. Now you're probably asking your next question, how do I go about mapping these competencies? And how do I develop a set of competencies for my corporation? Well, let me share with you some common methodologies. Really, there's only 4. But it's the competency mapping, it's called competency mapping, and it's essentially a method for identifying all the competencies for each job. And you can use either one or a combination. The customized strategy is a method that can be done with or without experts, and it includes things like a job analysis. You can select superior performers, have them fill a and analyze those jobs. Or you can use key event interviews or critical incident records or resource panels of individuals in specific jobs. Another strategy is what we call off the shelf, and that's because there's a growing number of quick and easy downloads from the internet. There are sets and assessment tools available, as well as specialist consulting firms who have their own off-the-shelf tools. A third methodology is recycle, and that means to take a number of the competency dictionaries that are available publicly online and search them to find a competency that you believe is similar and perhaps simply use them. The fourth one, a combination, it's just as it says. For instance, you might do a job analysis, you might define a competency or determine a competency and then use someone else's definition. But I want to say here that you need to review the data, confirm the reliability, determine the competencies that really impact performance in your organization, and when that's complete, you can write definitions and develop your own model. But let's take a moment and look at what a competency model really looks like. The competency model is really a collection of all the definitions that you have put together, all of the competency definitions for the selected job categories. The statements are arranged in a hierarchical ladder so that you can see the progression from simple to complex. In most cases, the higher level of the competencies represent things like a longer timeline or a progressive intensity. And typically, we don't want to see more than 4 to 5 different levels in that hierarchy. And once you complete the model, it becomes a blueprint for the end-to-end management of your talent management system, and it'll help you to align all of your systems. So at this point, you're probably asking another question. Barbara, how do I know that competencies really matter? Well, myself and my colleagues with us today, we've seen and experienced client situations where competencies really did make a difference, but let me share with you one of the earliest examples of this proof. And this comes from McClellan's work. Let's look at that now. In 1994, McClellan worked with L'Oreal, the world's largest beauty and cosmetic company. His challenge was to identify the competencies necessary for high-performing salespersons. And his research showed that role-specific, objective measures based on competencies resulted in 85% of their salespeople being successful and achieving their quotas in the very first year. Now, if you ask me, that's the power of competencies that drive performance. Now, the concept of competencies has been studied for over 25 years. For instance, my favorite author, Berger's research on companies that were successful over 25 years was able to show that competency played a key role in the longevity of these organizations. And let me share a little bit about that right now. His conclusion was that there's about 7 different factors that contributed to success. Look at our diagram here, you'll see that it ranges from having a performance-oriented culture to managing turnover and employee engagement and employee satisfaction. But if you go to the top of the arrow, look what it says. His research showed that the key factor in success over a 25-year period was the institutionalization of competencies in recruitment and selection. So let's turn now to an example of a competency model that identifies the various areas where competencies can be integrated, because that's the overall goal. You'll notice that the competencies are integrated into every key talent management function. Recruitment and selection, where you're acquiring your talent, development, performance management, and succession planning. And this integration of competencies into all of those talent management areas is really important because we need to attract and hang on to our super keeper employees throughout their life with our company. Now let's take a moment now for another poll to see where our listeners are with respect to how they're using competencies. So we want you to take a moment to select over the poll here. The question is, currently we use competencies in talent management practices. And listeners, please select all that applies. Where are you using competencies? Selection, development, performance management, succession planning, or perhaps you're not using competencies as the 6.3% in the registration showed. And while you're finishing up the poll, I'm just going to relay a little bit of my own experience. What I'm finding is that smaller organizations in particular that try to do competencies themselves without expert assistance usually starts with selection. And I think that's a pretty wise choice because it's really important to get the right people at the right skills at the right time. And then I also see that the competencies are used next in performance management. You know, and I think that's really quite an easy transition here and a good next step for sure. Once the managers see the power of competencies, I'm sure that you'll see how they can quickly begin to apply in every talent management function. I think we're just about ready here for the results of our poll. And the poll results, 52% for selection, which is interesting. That kind of matches my experience. And performance management, 59%. And development training for 49%. So we're starting to see really good use in really key elements of the talent management strategies here. Thank you very much for your participation. I'm going to turn it over now to Kevin Kokestick, our first expert panelist. Welcome, Kevin.
Thank you, Barbara.
And before I let you jump in, Kevin, I'm going to share a little bit of background here. 30 years of applied leadership in the human capital field and co-designer of Focus Leadership Development Institute. And currently, Kevin is with the I4CP organization, where prior to joining them full-time, he was serving on many of their advisory boards. And Kevin's going to share his research experience with you now.
Thanks again, Barbara. You know, you shared many examples of successful organizations and ideas from which we can all learn. Before I share some of the results of our latest reports, I'd like to explain to you what is involved in I4CP's research panel and to reinforce the rigor that we put behind our results. We focus our research to identify those best and next practices from regional, national, and global organizations that have successfully outperformed their competition for the preceding 5 years. Most specifically, in revenue growth, market share, profitability, and customer satisfaction. But when we indicate a best or next practice, we don't simply mean most popular or highest average. We want to help our members learn from those organizations that have demonstrated consistent success in their markets and industries. So we differentiate between high-performance organizations and low-performance organizations, and then we drill in to learn more about their people practices. Here you can see some of our members' logos and the growth since 2008. These members represent a sample of our research panel, along with several other Fortune 500 organizations. All right, Barbara talked earlier about competency mapping, and the model shared here is from one of our members. It represents one example of how a high-performance organization is mapping competencies to their future business plans and strategies. Our research shows that high-performing organizations recognize the importance of identifying competencies critical for success not only with today's challenges, but especially those that will position them successfully to achieve their future business plans. On the left of this model, you can see how the company started first with the business strategy, then linked it to the competencies needed to ensure the success of that strategy. Then they further defined the key attributes of each competency. As we have all experienced, behavioral anchors are essential to building understanding, buy-in, and acceptance. So you can see how they captured the availability of those competencies and attributes in the market. Basically, it's a supply and demand analysis, which is important for a thorough strategic workforce planning model. This process yields a list of competencies that can be used in all elements of their talent management strategy, from talent acquisition, as Barbara mentioned, through development, succession management, and selection. This process can also be applied to a local division, a region, or a national business, or to create a global map to help your organization manage talent on a grander scale. Here's an example of a study that identified some of the unique skills that make for an exceptional global leader. We're familiar with many of these, influencing and motivating people. But the nuance here is in from motivating those from different cultures, being resourceful, being sensitive to the individual local market, customers, preferences, politics, and practices. While these competencies are critical for global leaders, let's take a minute and see what your perceptions are about the readiness of future leaders. I think we have another poll, don't we, Barbara?
Yeah, we do, Kevin. Thank you very much. Now, the audience poll here at this time is, how does your organization compare? What competencies are most lacking in your next generation of leaders? And listeners, we want you to be able to select all that apply to your organization. So first is critical thinking, ability to create vision and engage others, collaborates with other business areas, and leadership understands the total business. So what applies to you? Go ahead now and put your answers in. Now, Kevin, while we're waiting, let's chat a little bit about the competency mapping again. You know, when I was looking at your tool there and the supply and the demand, I found it personally so helpful because it identifies the skills you need for future leaders. And do you find that most of your clients really like that approach?
Barbara, it's interesting you bring that one up. That was an interesting realization or a find in some of our research, and it really has lit up the ideas and the practices from some of our members. It's interesting how you go about building that supply curve from your sourcing and from your recruiting chain, and then building that into what the demand is going to be in the future of the business.
Now, one of the items that you also suggested here is that risk-taking and resourcefulness and dealing in an environment of ambiguity. That's a really important skill going forward, don't you think?
Absolutely, especially coming out of the recession. We're seeing a lot of complexity that our member companies are talking about with their leaders. They're dealing with global market influences and growing challenges in balancing both their local, their regional, domestic pieces or issues, and how to find the advantage from their competition. So complexity and agility are definite distinguishers for high-performance organizations.
And I really think that's really important in the global marketplace now. You know, you were talking about the importance of local markets and customers and preferences, but that cultural sensitivity when we're in a global market is becoming even more important, I think.
Absolutely. We're going to talk about that in just a minute. Good point.
Now, government and politics, what about that? Is that really important too?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, what we're seeing in the impact of what happened in Korea to the global market, or what happened in Europe with the working groups and the financial situation, all of those had impacts even to those that were domestic organizations because of the global supply chain now, and the impact of those political issues on the financial markets.
And the other thing that surprises me too is the timing. Things happen so fast. Whatever happens in Greece happens to us almost instantaneously.
Oh, don't we love the world of the modern media, right? Social media makes it instantaneous. How are we doing on our poll?
Well, I think that we're just about here at the end, so you can probably look at the results right now. Now, it's kind of interesting, Kevin, I'd like you to watch this with me here. You know, critical thinking, you mentioned that it was #1 priority in 2011, and what are we seeing here is 32% of people are saying it's really most lacking, but what's really most lacking is the ability to create vision and inspire others and being a very strategic thinker. So what do you think about that, Kevin, and how does it you know, kind of integrate with your research?
That's a great question, Barbara. Let's look at how our research came up on the next slide. These are the results from a study where respondents rated those competencies most lacking in their next generation of leaders. Basically, those leaders that would be driving the success of the business in the future. I found this interesting because of the shift in competence we're seeing in emerging leaders in just 2 years. Here, Barbara, you mentioned critical thinking was #1 in our research in 2011. We do this study about every 2 years. We're in the process of updating it this year. But it's interesting how our participants, our members on the call, are seeing differences in their businesses compared to what our research found 2 years ago. That change doesn't surprise me. Look how it compared to 2009. The interesting question that came out of this is, what are organizations doing to address these needs? Now that we know where the leaders are lacking for the future, let's look and see what organizations are doing to develop those future leaders. Here you can see the top 5 competencies included for executive development during that same period. Some of the observations I found interesting on this study was I was pleased to see that high-performance organizations were really on top of it. They had already been addressing the deficiencies in their executive development programs. Additionally, I was surprised to see how quickly competencies can change in both the priority and the emphasis in the curricula in only 2 years. For example, you can see here where executive priorities were in 2009, when we were in the depth of the recession, and how they evolved as the economy began to recover. I'm really curious to see what we're going to have this next year. I also found this data interesting on this next slide. These are competencies less frequently included in development programs, but that have a high or very high correlation with success. Just 41.7% of the firms included in their business and talent management processes agility and adaptability to manage global shifts. This came from our AMA I4CP Developing Successful Global Leader Study. We had 939 respondents. That agility and adaptability had a 0.41 correlation with high performance. Another nearly 47% included the expansion of the company's brand in the local and global commerce, and that had a 0.19 correlation. And then last, 44% included innovation management in their ITM processes. A frequent application of competencies are in the assessment processes in our talent management programs, whether it's for selection in hire or in internal promotion or development. We evaluated the use of 25 tests and assessment processes, and then we analyzed their correlation with market performance. The first group of 13 tools were frequently used by companies whose market performance index decreased over their 5-year period. Now, that's not to say that there's a cause and effect relationship, only that there's a high usage by those companies that did not perform well in their market. 8 assessment tools had a positive, yet not really significant correlation with market performance. And 4 tools were found to be highly correlated with high market performance. 2 of those included a very solid application of assessment methodology and the full Hogan personality suite. 2 assessments that we're going to learn more about from Charlie and Mark in just a moment. We also asked respondents which tools and processes they found to have the best impact on changing or enhancing leadership competencies. Of no surprise, a well-designed and implemented performance management process, incorporating a well-crafted individual development plan as part of the discussion and coaching, is still the #1 most successful tools used to build competencies in leaders. Of note are some of the other more common and well-known processes, as well as some of the rapidly emerging options that are on the list. One important option here we saw in the research is the reinforcement that any tool or process purchased off the shelf had greater relevance, received greater acceptance, and yielded greater return to their organization when it was tailored and customized to fit the business drivers and cultural values of the organization. We found that to be a key market distinguisher. All right. Now, Barbara, I'd like to turn it back to you. I think we have another poll.
Yes, we do. Thanks a lot, Kevin. And audience, the poll this time is asking you this question. What strategy would you or have you used in creating your competency framework? And this time we only want you to select one. The customized methodology, off the shelf, recycle existing frameworks, or some combination of the above. So go ahead and put your answers in right now. And I just want to comment here too that while we're waiting for you to put your answers in, that in my experience I'm finding a lot of the organizational competency concepts are misunderstood, and some organizations think that they can just take a set of employee skills and recycle it and use it without really testing to see if it really fits. You know, it might sound good, but it isn't very accurate, and it probably wouldn't fit into the business strategy. So that might be one reason why you need to use an expert. Kevin, does this kind of surprise you that a lot of people go it on their own?
No, it doesn't surprise me that they attempt it on their own, Barbara. We have a lot of professionals in the field. What we find, though, is the rigor that goes behind marrying or matching and mapping those processes, whether it be assessment or development or selection processes, to the organization was a market distinguisher. That doesn't mean that the others were mistaken or did it poorly. It just means that those organizations, at least from our research, it means that those organizations who took the time to implement the rigor of working with an expert and mapping it to the organization saw much higher return on that investment and a much greater acceptance and support and follow-up and utilization of those results. So it made it worth the time and the investment.
Yeah, one of the things you mentioned was the time, and I think people have to realize that a customized competency model for your organization is a very iterative process. It's probably about 6 or 7 months of time, but it's really well worth it. From a time perspective, what do you see as a normal time frame to get this kind of thing done in a medium-sized organization?
It's a great question, because even though our research did not address that, we didn't probe into the amount of time and break that down to the variable to the size of the organization. But from my experience, and over 30 years, the geographic spread as well as the size definitely has an impact. And I think it varies depending on whether you're looking at assessment tools or competency mapping for development or selection. So it's going to take a couple of 3-4 months at the very least, depending on how many people and how widespread. And it's worth that time and investment. The more people involved, the less time, the fewer, the greater time.
And I find the same too, and I find that in getting the employees involved and taking the time, the engagement of employees in the overall process also brings about real win-win. But I think it's time that we can look now at the results of the poll here. It's really kind of interesting. Here, look at 57% are using a combination of all of these methodologies. The next largest one is customized, of course. Off the shelf, which to me is really, buying something and then just using it without really doing any testing and assessment and compliance with your organization. So are you kind of surprised at any of this?
Not surprised, actually hopeful. I'm glad to see that there's a low percentage of off the shelf, and not surprised at all to see that there is a combination of some of the above, as well as possibly some of the other activities that aren't offered here as an option. So that's fairly consistent with what we see in our research.
Yes, me too. Now, as we leave the poll, I just want to repeat, Kevin, what Kevin has said here, that one important observation is you use or any process that you purchase off the shelf has to or will have greater relevance, receive greater acceptance, and yield greater return when it's tailored and customized to fit your organization. So now it's time to introduce you to a case study with H.H. Gregg. And our case study here is going to give you an experience of how they have implemented competencies within their organization. And we've got two presenters for this segment, so let me introduce them to you. First of all, we have Charlie Young, who is the Chief Human Resource Officer for H.H. Gregg. And prior to joining this company, he was Vice President of Human Resources Store Operations and Supply Chain for Sears Holding Company. And he also served in the role of Vice President of Human Resources for Sears Retail Stores and was the Director of Human Resources while working for Sears. Mark is President of HR Dimensions in Indianapolis, a CPI partner. And once again, he has 25 years experience of executive management in all functional areas of the organization. So Charlie, how about starting us off today by giving us a little bit more detail on the background of your company?
Thank you, Barbara. I appreciate it. Well, for those of you that don't know H.H. Gregg, we're a leading appliance and electronics retailer. As a matter of fact, we've started to migrate into some different categories in furniture and fitness and some other categories that we're exploring. We have roughly 230 locations, as Barbara alluded to, in 20 states. And I think the interesting thing about the company is with the changes in the video business, we're really focused on the current model before we continue to expand. Our stated objective is to become a national retailer, but getting the business model right is very important for the company. As we migrate towards the HR side of H.H. Gregg and look at where the company was in 2008 when I first joined the organization, we were really positioned for growth, but the HR core processes were very manual. There was really no people strategy associated or linked with the business. It was a transactional HR function, and many of our audience out there really does understand what I'm talking about. So it was important to really establish the function to support the growth objectives of the company. And one of those key elements to support growth is assessing talent, the capability that we have in the field, in the corporate offices, and making sure that we could do that to support the objectives of the company. So as you look at a people strategy, if you will, around growth, I was challenged along with the senior management team by the CEO and the directors to really develop a people strategy that could support growth. And what I mean by that is a people strategy that was linked to the business objectives and that contained the tools and the processes necessary to source and select the right talent for growth. So where did we begin? The initial step in our growth strategy, and many of you that are with growth companies or have been with a company that's growing rapidly in a multi-unit environment, is to really get the field structure right, because as we're growing stores, getting store general managers or general managers of stores, sales managers of stores, as well as our region manager, which is equivalent to a district manager, the most important part of our field structure was to really be able to assess that talent as we grow and as we grow rapidly. I mean, in 2008 through 2012, we grew over 100 stores. So the first step was really to develop an assessment center around evaluating that talent. And that was important. That was really important to understand the competencies of that group. And we did focus groups, did a lot of job analysis to develop the assessment center for that population. What it did highlight, though, was the deficiencies in our corporate structure, because even though the corporate structure wasn't growing as quickly as the field structure, it was still growing. And those individuals in the corporate structure were instrumental to making key strategic decisions. So we really had to take a look at how we assess and select the talent in that group. So what is an assessment center? And we've talked a lot about it. It is a process to evaluate and select talent. It's not a store concept. It's not a brick and mortar concept. It's not an omni-channel concept. It's really around the selection and evaluation of talent. And it's really based on competencies and skills of a particular job or set of jobs. There's lots of techniques you use. You use assessment tools themselves, whether it's testing. You use multi-interview panels. You use behavioral interview guides, you used role plays and business simulations that Mark will talk about, but they were the key things to really help you to understand the talent so that you could make a more objective hiring decision as opposed to a subjective hiring decision. And that's critical, especially as you're growing as rapidly as we were. So how did we start the process? In conjunction with HR Dimensions, and we'll touch on that in the ensuing slides, myself and Dennis, we really had to define the vision, what we were looking for. One of the key things from Dennis May, our CEO at the time, was it was really important to have competencies that reflected our successful culture and then allowed the culture to evolve as we got bigger. So many of you know, as you start with a circle of stores or the circle of the core company, and you grow that circle out and expand out, that culture can change as you grow bigger. So it was really important that whatever we developed from a competency standpoint allowed us to evolve our culture, maintain our culture. And I think it first started, you have to define what the culture is, and it started with the interviewing of the top 16 officers, and that was facilitated by Mark and his team to really understand what the culture is now and how does that culture evolve, and then what the key competencies of the culture were. And that was as important, very, very important, to really determine how we wanted to develop the assessment center. So on page 37, you'll see the 9 competencies. And I think what's important here is that many of you have probably seen these competencies before. And the key to these competencies is not the words themselves, industrial knowledge, leadership, versatility. It's the definition of what they are. And Mark's going to touch on those in the ensuing slides about how do you define leadership versatility at H.H. Gregg. A key component of aligning on these competencies, these 9 competencies, was a meeting. Once we determined what they were, HR Dimensions, in conjunction with the senior management team, had a meeting where we all aligned, based on dialogue and discussion, that these were the competencies and the ensuing definitions that took place. So now I'm going to turn it over to Mark, and he's going to walk through the tactical assessment center development. Mark?
Thanks, Charlie. And I want to thank you, too, Charlie, for being here and taking time. It's really been a joy working with H.H. Gregg, exciting because of their growth, and really fun working with Charlie. We've talked for 20 years in the HR community about becoming strategic business partners, and I got to tell you, Charlie is one of the most advanced executives in that area that we've worked with. Well, I'm going to talk the next few minutes about not just the assessment center, but the whole selection process, because we were engaged to do various aspects of that. And the first step, after we had defined the competencies, was to develop a leadership interview guide. And H.H. Gregg's model for interviewing top candidates for senior level positions is to use a panel of interviewers, usually 3. So we broke the 9 competencies into 3 separate interview guides so that each interviewer would just be focusing on 3 of those at a time. Now I'm going to take you inside to show you one page of what that looks like. And when Charlie said the definition is of the old cliches where the rubber hits the road, you can see in the definition where it comes to life. And we tried to use, as we crafted those definitions, the exact words that we heard from the people we interviewed. And I think that's what got them to accept these so readily that they did when we went through the exercise Charlie talked about. The next section, what to look for, we tried to give guidance on each competency as they listened and interviewed candidates to look for these specific things. And then what to ask, we actually gave them a couple different behavioral-based questions that they could use to look at those competencies. And then the bottom of it is we asked them to, on each competency, to tell us whether they thought that they had demonstrated that competency or not.
What's really important, as Mark alluded to, is what to look for is our folks, when I first got there, really did not use behavioral-based interview guides. There were no assessments. There were no real tools for selection. And so actually demonstrating to them what the behaviors are and what to look for under that section was very, very important in helping them to determine whether this person met that specific competency or not. Mark?
Okay, next I'm going to show you just the example of the summary sheet. We would then summarize each of the interviewers' scores, and the score was really just whether they demonstrated or did not demonstrate each competency, and then we totaled how many of those were. The next one then summarizes that into a recommendation from that interview team as to whether they were going to recommend the person or not. And as you can see, you don't have to have all 9 competencies to be hired at H.H. Gregg. Their philosophy is if there's a couple developmental needs, they'll coach around those and develop around those. But if it's more than 2 or 3 of those, then they're probably not a fit. Okay, now I'd like to go on to the next stage chronologically in what we did. We thought it was important we focus now on the competencies, but there's also the KSAs, knowledge, skills, and abilities. We developed a job order guide for HR to use when they sat down with the hiring managers. It was a detailed questionnaire that they filled out. They came back then and put the information into some software that we developed for them that captured those KSAs and then would spit out actually an interview guide that is customized for each position. So that went into a software historical database and captured that for the next time that they filled that position. Go ahead, Charlie.
Well, just to comment on that, I think Mark's team did a fantastic job on this. Many interview guides are very generic. They tend to, or you try to fit them to every job in the organization. Mark's team, the exceptional work they did around this, allows us to customize these interview guides to our assessment center. So it's director level and above roles, some senior level managers we do as well. And so now we can have a unique guide for the position to really hone in on making sure we make the right decision around that position. And Mark's team did a fantastic job developing that.
Thanks, Charlie. Next, I'd like to talk about the actual assessment center itself. And the place we started was selecting the assessment tools. We brought in a industrial psychologist who was very competent, schooled in psychometrics. She had experience with over 250 different assessment tools. And so we gave her the 9 competencies that had been defined and asked her to make recommendations. And what came out of that were 2 cognitive assessments and 2 behavioral leadership style assessments. The last one there, the conflict resolution, was added later. The reason we added it later is, quite frankly, we had a failure.
We did.
We had a person that went through the process, got hired, and did not perform. So the specific issues around that we felt needed to be addressed, and that's why we added the Thomas Gilman conflict mode instrument. The others, you see the Hogan ones there that Kevin's company identified as highly correlated to performance of companies. The Watson-Glaser is the most widely used cognitive tool for selecting leaders in business. Now I'm going to show you just a couple of examples of the output of those tools, and this is one of the Hogan Leadership Potential. We like it because this is a quick summary page of the things it measures. You can see very quickly those things to hone in on. Sometimes in the results, and we'll have an example here in a moment, you'll see an area where it really stands out, and the next one is the Watson-Glaser. I'm going to move to it. The Watson-Glaser output By the way, of all of those 5 tools, this is the only one that has to be proctored in-house. You actually have to give it to them. It's not timed, but you have to proctor it. And then the final one is that I wanted to show you is the WPI. And here's an example of, if you saw one like this, it helps us to probe. We would want to talk to this candidate about their leadership style. It appears that they might have some authoritarian type leadership characteristics that we'd want to probe. Okay, moving on to the rest of the assessment center development. The business simulation really involved a case study. We built a company that was not in retail. We purposely decided not to use retail because we knew that they would be assessing candidates from outside retail, and so to level the playing field, we designed a company in the financial services area. And in the case study, a candidate is given all kinds of information, from org charts to historical financial statements, internal memos, strategic plans, a very big document, of a package of documents. And part of what they have to do in a short amount of time is sort through that and figure out what is it they need to help them go through these different exercises. So a role play is one of those. It's done with observers who record the results of those around the competencies. We also then use behavioral interviews, a team of behavioral interviews. And in the business simulation, another piece of that is they're giving 3 different problems that are existing in this company and asked to choose one, go away, put together an action plan, come back and present it to top management. So then we score all that, we put our heads together with all the assessors, and we come up with a final recommendation. And the report that goes to H.H. Gregg is 25 plus pages of recommendations and results. But just like what we ask the interviewers to do, we give a thumbs up or thumbs down on what we think the candidate should be hired or not.
And I think this process, as we finalize the document or the results in the 25 pages, in addition to Mark finalizing that for us, we as a team get together and we calibrate. We take this report, we walk through the results of this report, we walk through our behavioral interview guides, and the panel of 3 and 4 people, depending upon who we're interviewing, we calibrate, we make a decision. So the data point around the assessment center is a critical data point, but it's not the only one that we use. Mark?
All right, thank you. Well, I think we're ready to turn it back to Barbara. Barbara?
Thank you very much. I really want to thank all of our presenters for sharing how competencies drive success. And so it's time now for your questions. If you have a question, type it in the question box, and this can be accessed by clicking in the red arrow at the top of your screen to open the control panel, and then click the question or the chat feature and type in your question. So we're going to see some questions coming in pretty quickly here. Oh, the first one, Charlie, is for you. And here's the question. Why did you choose to bring in outside resources for developing your competencies and the assessment center instead of using something perhaps off the shelf or doing it yourself?
Well, that's a good question, Barbara, and I think many of the individuals on the webinar can relate to this. Is we did not have the competency in-house to begin to take on this this project. It was a massive project in terms of looking at the competencies within our corporate offices at the director level and above, and it was critical. It was critical that we did it right, and that we had the expertise to help us define a process and tools necessary to do it. So, you know, HR Dimensions fit that bill. As I said before, they did a terrific job. They had the expertise, and we needed to get it done in an expedited manner and leverage a tool that could help us select key talent. So it was really never a thought to do it inside. If you have the structure inside, then you can do it. And I agree with Kevin. It really does need to be customized.
Mark, we actually have a question I think you can address.
Okay.
During your project here, what lesson did you learn from developing this process for H.H. Gregg?
Well, I think it's a good question. The lesson I learned is that to listen to the voice of the customer very closely, and that guided us through the whole process. We didn't hurry it. You had to wait for this to kind of digest within the organization, and certainly to get the buy-in from all the senior managers was a key part of this as well. That's very critical.
I think we might have time actually for a couple more questions, so I want to go to Kevin. One of the questions here is, the webinar spoke about the benefits of competencies on organizational performance for organizations, but how do competencies and the competency approach benefit employees?
That's an interesting question, Barbara. Competencies become the language that everyone in the organization uses when they're looking at whether it's career planning and development or whether they're looking at developmental activities. And it allows employees, by using common definitions with consistently behaviorally anchored terms, it allows employees to measure where they are based on their current job requirements, where they are based on future opportunities they would like to achieve, and then helps them to plan how to get from point A to point B. So it becomes a very empowering characteristics when employees, management, and systems all match together.
Now, there's time for one more. Charlie, can we go back to you? The question here is related to the culture. In your presentation, you mentioned that it was really a culture change initiative. Did you really see a big change in your culture after you have concluded this process?
Well, Barbara, we did. I think initially, and again, I think the audience can attest to this. They relate to it. They live it every day. Is that the process when I got to H.H. Gregg around assessing talent was purely subjective in a nutshell. And the whole goal was to make it more objective. There were no use of behavioral interview guides. There were no real assessment tools that were used. So while the individuals that were selecting talent were using what they knew, they did in some way subconsciously opine for something that could allow them to make better decisions. And I think as we migrated through this process with HR Dimensions and Mark's team, they really gained an appreciation of what the process can really mean to them. So now, we went from a culture of really never using anything to a culture where we really leverage the assessment center, we leverage the behavioral interview guides. I think they'd be essentially lost without those tools today. Not to say that each one in of itself is a decision maker. They're each data points. The whole process, the assessment center helps to eliminate subjectivity through the process, and so I think it's fairly well embedded in the culture as before the process. There really was no culture around selection.
Well, thank each of you for taking the time to answer these questions. And there are some more questions here, but this is all the time we have. So we will make an effort to get your question answered offline if it hasn't been answered already. Now, before we say our goodbye, I want to recap what you heard today. Our message is from CPI that DNA drives success. Competencies are the backbone of our talent management strategies, especially when they're institutionalized in the employee selection and performance process. As we've learned from Kevin, his organization, the I4CP organization, his research, and Charles and Mark's competency success story, competencies that are customized to the organization's specific needs are really the key component to performance and success. So thank you for joining us today, and on behalf of Career Partners International and our panelists, thank you so much for being with us today. We hope you found the session informative and helpful. A recording of today's session will be available within the next week on our website, and our local career partners firms are happy to provide you with additional information on today's topic. Your feedback ensures future webinars continue to be relevant and add value to your organization. So as you exit the webinar, please complete the survey that opens in a separate browser on your computer. The exit survey is also where you request the certification for completion of the HR recertification credits for attending today's webinar, and we'll mail those certificates to participants who attended the full presentation and responded to yes in the exit survey. For talent management discussions, articles, and blogs, visit us at www.cpiworld.com and join our conversations on LinkedIn and Twitter and Facebook. And not only that, please be on the lookout for your invitation to our Fall 2013 webinar. Until then, have a great day, and thanks so much for joining us.